Hey there, curious minds. Welcome to this intellectual journey. Have you ever wondered how many of history's greatest works were penned by hands that had to remain hidden? What if I told you that some of literature's most celebrated authors weren't who they claimed to be? Today we're going to uncover one of the literary world's best-kept secrets, the story of how the female voice emerged, not with a shout, but with an ingenious whisper, a brilliant strategy born out of necessity and oppression. It's a tale of false identities, immense risks, and monumental triumphs. This is the chronicle of women writers who, to get their work read, had to trick the entire world by adopting male names. Get ready to discover the true identities behind some of history's most important literary figures. Before we dive in, I wanted to tell you a bit about the visuals you'll be seeing. To bring this narrative to life, I've used AI tools to generate the images. So think of them as a canvas, a way to illustrate the ideas and atmosphere of what I'm sharing with you. They won't always be an exact or literal representation, but rather a visual accompaniment to help you let your imagination run wild with me. I truly hope you enjoy it. To grasp the magnitude of their feat, we must first travel back to the 19th century. Imagine a society where a woman's role was strictly defined. Her place was the home, her purpose marriage and motherhood. The public sphere, the world of ideas, art, and politics, was an exclusive men's club. In this context, the idea of a woman writer was, for many, ridiculous and even unnatural. Intellectual creativity was considered a masculine quality. Critics of the era often dismissed women's works as mere sentimental ramblings, lacking the depth and seriousness of masculine genius. Critic George Henry Lewis, for instance, even wrote that women could only excel in novels due to their capacity for detail and emotion, but lacked the capacity for abstraction necessary for great literature. It was an invisible yet incredibly solid barrier, built from prejudice and societal expectations. So what could a woman do with a story burning within her, with an intellect that refused to be silenced? The answer was one of the most effective and audacious strategies in literary history, the use of a male pen name. It wasn't just a simple name change, it was the creation of an alter ego. This pen name was an armor, a shield that allowed them to submit their manuscripts to publishers without immediate dismissal, simply because they bore a female name. It guaranteed their work would be judged on its merit, not by the gender of the writer. It was a gateway into a world that was otherwise closed off to them. Perhaps the most iconic case is that of the Bronte sisters. In 1847, they published their novels under the names Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. They chose deliberately ambiguous names, sounding neither distinctly male nor female, to shield themselves from prejudice. The success was immediate and resounding. Charlotte Bronte, under the name Currer Bell, published Jane Eyre. Emily, as Ellis Bell, gave us Wuthering Heights. And Anne, as Acton Bell, Agnes Grey. The public and critics were captivated by the strength and passion of these works, assuming only a man could have written them with such vehemence. Speculation about the true identity of the Bell brothers became the talk of London's literary world. Who were these mysterious geniuses? The revelation that they were three sisters, daughters of a clergyman from a remote parish, caused a monumental stir. The deception had worked perfectly. But the Brontes weren't alone. Across the English Channel, in France, Amandine Aurore Dupin became one of the most important literary figures of her time under the name George Sand. She not only wrote novels, but lived her life defying all societal conventions. George Sand adopted masculine attire and a male name to move freely around Paris, to access places and intellectual circles forbidden to women. Her pen name wasn't just a signature, it was a passport to freedom, a declaration that her genius had no gender. And then there's the case of Marianne Evans, who became arguably the most important novelist of the Victorian era under the name George Eliot. She chose this name to ensure her deeply philosophical and psychological work would be taken seriously from the outset. Marianne Evans was already a renowned editor and translator, but she knew that as a female novelist, her work would be pigeonholed. As George Eliot, she wrote masterpieces like Middlemarch, which Virginia Woolf would later describe as one of the few English books written for grown-up people. The world hailed her as a masculine genius. The choice of pen name wasn't random. The name George belonged to her partner, George Henry Lewis, and Eliot was, she said, a good word, easy to pronounce. It was a deliberate construction, a brand designed for success in a male-dominated literary market. This phenomenon wasn't limited to Europe. While documentation is scarcer, we have indications of similar struggles worldwide. In 19th century India, for instance, women like Krupabai Satyanandan wrote about the harsh realities of female life, challenging the norms of their own culture. In Japan, during the Meiji era, authors like Higuchi Ichio wrote about the lives of women on the margins of society. Although they didn't use male pen names in the same way, they faced immense pressure to conform to traditional roles, and their writing was an act of rebellion. In Latin America, authors like the Argentine Juana Manuela Gorriti or the Peruvian Clorinda Mato de Turner also challenged conventions. They wrote about political and social themes, often under fierce scrutiny, paving the way for future generations of women writers on the continent. However, using a male pen name came with an enormous personal and psychological cost. Imagine the pain of hearing praise directed at your male alter ego, knowing that the same acclaim would be denied to you if your true identity were known. It was a form of creative schizophrenia. Charlotte Bronte wrote about the necessity of concealment as a burden. It was a constant tension, the fear of being discovered, the fear that their success would evaporate if the world knew the truth. They lived with the dread that their genius would be invalidated by their gender. Moreover, there was the frustration of not being able to fully partake in their own success. While Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell were celebrated in London's salons, the Bronte sisters remained in their remote parsonage, invisible to the world that acclaimed them. The revelation of their identities often provoked a fierce backlash. When it became known that George Eliot was a woman, some critics retracted their praise. The very work previously considered a pinnacle of intellect was suddenly re-examined and criticized for its feminine sentimentalism. This demonstrates that the pen name was more than just a marketing tool. It was a social experiment that exposed the deep hypocrisy of literary criticism. It proved beyond a doubt that gender prejudice was real and was blinding the world to the talent of half the population. Think about it for a moment. The massive success of these authors under male names was irrefutable proof of their talent. Critics couldn't argue that their books were bad because they had already celebrated them. The only variable that changed was gender, and that exposed everything. The triumph of these women wasn't just publishing. Their true triumph was breaking the mold. It was proving that a woman's voice could be as powerful, as philosophical, and as universal as any man's. Every book sold was a blow against the wall of patriarchy. They opened a door that could never be fully closed again. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we see a new wave of women writers who, while still facing obstacles, no longer felt the absolute need to hide. The battle wasn't over, but crucial ground had been gained. Consider Virginia Woolf. She reflected deeply on this legacy in her essay, A Room of One's Own. She argued that a woman needs financial independence and a space of her own to create. She was a direct heir to the struggles of the Brontes and George Eliot. Woolf imagined a fictional sister for Shakespeare named Judith, with the same talent as her brother but none of his opportunities. Condemned to silence and oblivion. This figure represented all the women whose genius was lost to history due to lack of opportunity. The 19th century writers refused to be Judith Shakespeare. Instead of accepting silence, they found a crack in the system. Their use of pen names was an act of brilliant subversion. They didn't ask permission to enter the literary canon. They snuck in through the back door and redefined it from within. The legacy of these women is incalculable. They not only left us immortal novels, but changed the rules of the game. They proved that talent has no gender and that a powerful voice, no matter its origin, will eventually find a way to be heard. Their deception was, in reality, an act of profound intellectual honesty. They taught us that the most imposing barriers can often be overcome with ingenuity and bravery. That sometimes, to change the system, you first have to learn to play by its rules, even if that means wearing a mask. Next time you read Jane Eyre or Middlemarch, remember the story behind the name on the cover. Remember Charlotte Bronte and Marianne Evans, women who fought not only with their characters, but with the entire world for the simple right to tell their stories. Their triumph is a reminder that literature is a battlefield where silent wars are fought for representation, identity, and truth. And they, without a doubt, were some of its greatest and most astute generals. Their struggle, though begun in the 19th century, continues to resonate today. Every time a new female voice emerges in literature, science, or any male-dominated field, it follows the path they painstakingly paved with such effort and sacrifice. It wasn't just about writing novels. It was about asserting their humanity and intellect in a world that denied them. It was a silent revolution waged with ink and paper instead of weapons, but with an equally profound and lasting impact. The story of these authors compels us to ask, how many masterpieces were lost forever? How many Jane Eyres and Wuthering Heights were never written because their authors lacked the opportunity, the courage, or the means to challenge the system? It's a loss we can never quantify. A silence in history that reminds us of the importance of listening to all voices, especially those that have been systematically marginalized. The fight of these pioneers left us an invaluable legacy and a crucial warning. In summary, the male pen name was much more than a trick. It was a master key, a tool for infiltration into the bastion of male culture. It was the literary Trojan horse, allowing women not only to enter the walled city, but to conquer it from within with the strength of their words. They proved that genius doesn't respond to chromosomes, and that a powerful story transcends any label society tries to impose. They taught us that an author's true identity isn't in their name, but in the truth and beauty they are capable of conveying. It's fascinating how the society of the time, so obsessed with the nature of genders, was completely fooled. They praised the masculine strength and virile logic in the writings of the Brontes and Eliot, only to discover that those qualities came from women. It was an involuntary deconstruction of their own prejudices. Consider the long-term impact. By being accepted into the canon under their pen names, they secured their place in history. When their true identities were revealed, it was already too late to erase them. They had secured their literary immortality, forcing the world to accept that women could, in fact, be literary geniuses. Furthermore, this strategy not only benefited the authors, but enriched universal literature. They brought perspectives and experiences that had been ignored. They wrote about the inner lives of women, their frustrations and desires, with an honesty that was only possible under the veil of anonymity. The irony is delicious. To write their most intimate truth as women, they had to pretend to be men. The mask gave them the freedom to be themselves on the page, a freedom that real life denied them. Their novels are, in many ways, the emotional autobiographies they could never have published openly. This phenomenon also teaches us about the power of perception. A manuscript without a name is just a collection of words. But attach a male name to it in the 19th century, and it becomes a work of potential genius. Attach a female one, and it becomes a pastime. They expose this ridiculous yet powerful dynamic. The courage required for this shouldn't be underestimated. There was no guarantee of success. They risked ridicule and ostracism if discovered. Every letter sent to an editor, every pen name chosen was an act of faith in their own talent and a gamble against a system designed to make them fail. And they didn't just face the system, they also faced their own doubts, instilled by the very society they lived in. The question, am I good enough? Surely tormented them, but their desire to create was stronger than fear and doubt. That is the true mark of an artist. The story of their struggle is also a lesson about the importance of allies. Men like publisher George Smith, who took a chance on Jane Eyre, or George Henry Lewis, who unconditionally supported Marianne Evans, played crucial roles. They demonstrated that the fight for equality isn't solely the task of the oppressed. Ultimately, their story is profoundly optimistic. It's proof that talent, like water, always finds a crack through which to flow. It can be dammed, diverted, or ignored for a time, but eventually the pressure becomes too great and it breaks through with unstoppable force. The bravery of these women to claim their voice, even covertly, laid the groundwork for later movements. Suffragism and the first wave of feminism in the early 20th century drew from the intellectual audacity of these literary pioneers. Cultural revolution often precedes political change. Even today in the 21st century, the echo of their struggle endures. Authors like J.K. Rowling initially published as J.K. to appeal to a young male audience. While the context is different, the underlying strategy of neutralizing gender to avoid prejudice shows that the battle isn't entirely over. They compel us to be more critical readers, to ask who narrates the stories we consume and which voices might be missing. They invite us to search the margins, to discover forgotten authors, and to reevaluate the canon we've inherited. A canon that, as we've seen, wasn't always honest about its origins. The history of literature is far richer and more complex than it's often presented to us. It's not a straight line of great men, but an intricate mosaic of voices, some shouting, others whispering, and some, like our protagonists, speaking through an ingeniously constructed disguise. Their legacy is an invitation to audacity. To all those who feel their voice isn't heard, whose perspective is ignored, the story of these 19th century women writers tells you, find your pen name, your strategy, your crack in the wall. The world needs to hear what you have to say. They weren't seeking personal fame in the modern sense. They sought something far more fundamental, the validation of their work and intellect. The fact that they were willing to forego personal credit for their masterpieces demonstrates the purity of their motivation. It was art for art's sake. And while we speak of deception, in a deeper sense, it was the gatekeepers of culture who deceived themselves with their prejudices. The authors simply presented them with the truth of their talent in the only way they were willing to accept it, wrapped in fiction. The story of George Sand, for example, goes beyond literature. She became a symbol of female liberation. Her relationships with figures like Chopin, her independent lifestyle, and her political activism made her a truly revolutionary figure, far more than just a simple novelist. This period was a crucible where the identity of the modern woman writer was forged. They transitioned from being an anomaly to a force to be reckoned with. Every book published, every positive review received under a false name, further weakened the structure of literary patriarchy. The impact on female readers of the era must also have been profound. Even if they didn't know the author's true identities, the stories of complex and intelligent heroines like Jane Eyre or Maggie Tulliver in Eliot's The Mill on the Floss offered them role models and validation of their own inner experiences. Thus, their influence spread in concentric circles. First, by deceiving publishers. Second, by captivating critics and the public. And third, by inspiring female readers and future women writers. It was a large-scale cultural change operation executed with astonishing precision. The pressure to maintain secrecy was immense. In one letter, Charlotte Brontë implored her publisher to keep her identity secret, describing fame as something that would strip her of the shadow where she could work in peace. Anonymity was not only a shield, but also a creative sanctuary. When the truth about George Eliot came to light, the shock was double. Not only was she a woman, but she also lived openly with a married man, George Henry Lewis. She defied conventions not just on the page, but in her own life, demonstrating a radical coherence between her thought and her existence. Today, as we take for granted the presence of women in all areas of culture, it's crucial to look back and honor these pioneers. They didn't walk a pre-laid path. They built it themselves through hostile territory, with ingenuity as their compass and talent as their sole weapon. Their story teaches us that progress isn't inevitable. It's the result of individual acts of courage, of people who dare to imagine a different world and are willing to risk everything to make it a reality. They didn't wait for the world to change, they changed it themselves, one word at a time. This journey through literary history shows us how the female voice, once repressed and forced into hiding, became one of the most transformative forces in modern culture. Its emergence wasn't an event, but a process, a constant and courageous struggle. Next time you see an author's name on a book, take a moment. Think about the person behind that name, about the struggles they might have faced to get those words into your hands. The history of literature is full of ghosts, heroes, and secrets. Remembering these women is not just an act of historical justice, it's a source of inspiration. It reminds us that the limitations we perceive are often social constructs, and that with the right strategy and an unwavering will, they can be challenged and overcome. World literature would be infinitely poorer without their contributions. Without the psychological complexity of George Eliot, the Gothic passion of the Brontës, or the social romanticism of George Sand, they not only earned a seat at the table, but changed the menu forever. Their ultimate triumph wasn't when their identities were revealed, but the fact that even after the revelation, their works endured. They proved to be so powerful that not even the most ingrained prejudice could bring them down once they had established themselves. Genius once unleashed is unstoppable. It was a war of attrition. Every copy sold, every reader moved was a small victory. And those small victories, accumulated over decades, brought about a seismic shift in the cultural perception of genius and creativity. The story of the male pen name is a masterclass in power, prejudice, and the incredible resilience of the human creative spirit. It's an essential chapter not just in the history of literature, but in the history of the fight for equality. From the Brontës in their remote Yorkshire parsonage to George Sand in the heart of Paris, these women formed an undeclared sisterhood, separated by geography but united by a common purpose, to change the world with their words, even if it had to be in secret. Their lives and works are a testament to the transformative power of art. Art as a refuge, as a weapon, and as a tool for forging a new reality. They taught us that to rewrite society's rules, sometimes you first have to write a great novel. And so the female voice emerged, not as a granted gift, but as a right conquered through ingenuity, perseverance, and a talent so undeniable that not even anonymity could contain it. Their legacy isn't just in libraries, it's in every person who dares to raise their voice against silence. In the end, these authors didn't just write novels. They wrote a new chapter in human history, one where the female voice could not be ignored. A chapter we are still reading and hopefully continuing today. Next time you doubt your own voice, remember these giants. Remember they faced a world that told them they couldn't, shouldn't, weren't capable, and their answer was to write some of the most immortal works of all time. May their audacity be your inspiration. Deception was their method, but truth was their message. And that truth of the human experience told with honesty and brilliance is what makes them eternal. The name on the cover is temporary, but the imprint they left on the souls of their readers is forever. In conclusion, the emergence of the female voice in literature through male pen names is not a mere footnote in history. It's one of its central plots. a story of intellectual espionage and creative rebellion that reveals as much about the society that made it necessary as it does about the brilliant women who carried it out. Thank you so much for joining me on this profound and revealing journey through the secret history of literature. It has been an honor to share these stories of courage and genius with all of you curious minds. If this story has inspired you or made you think, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What other authors do you know who defied norms? Let me know in the comments below. And if you don't want to miss more hidden secrets in history and literature, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell.